line up outside, and then you'll get your uniform certificate when you walk out the door. Those will be handed to you as you walk out the door. If you have any other questions about CLE, I can't answer them, so we'll figure out who can. So I do want to introduce Matt Orley over here. Just wave. You'll notice that he is not using PowerPoint. He is using boards and ink, and he will be drawing what he hears today. All of you will be taking notes, presumably. He will be taking pictures in drawings of what he hears. So enjoy that little aspect, and that will be displayed afterwards out in the hallway at some point, somewhere else, way away. You'll see them as the week goes by. There'll be more and more of these visual memories of what we've been doing here. So we have a full 3.5-day program for you all on elections and redistricting. It is on the agenda that you've got in front of us. We understand our colleagues in the other programs also have good programming, but we think you should stick with us throughout. So it's one thing after another. Later on, it'll be everything you need to know about primaries coming right up, and the day will just rock on through, and I hope you'll stay with us. But for today, at this moment, we are here to talk about election perspectives from across the aisle. And to do that, I want to introduce my friend and MIT professor, Charles Stewart III. He's a political scientist, and he is also the director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. And I appreciate that you're here with us, and I'm going to just turn it right over.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Wendy, and thanks you all for being here. There's a little bit of reverb. Are we okay with the sound level? Okay, because I keep feeling like I should say, now batting, number 3, Harman Killebrew. Anyway, it's exciting to be to kick off this series of panels here at NCSL this year. Today's panel, as the title suggests, is an overview of important policy areas in elections. So I think everybody in this room understands that these days that elections can be a hot political topic, and we're not going to deny that at all, but we want to do quite a different spin from the normal kind of gladiatorial battle over policy, which is to talk about a number of issues, and there's going to be 4 in particular that we're going to focus on and then broaden out after that. Those issues will be funding, workforce security, and list maintenance. And we're going to be talking about 2 things, I think, in general. One is differences across the political spectrum, different perspectives on these topics. This is an area of public policy. I like to remind my students, like any area of public policy, there's disagreement. Reasonable people will disagree based on their experience, their values, what they're trying to get out of things. And so we should respect that. At the same time, there's surprising amount of agreement among people who think thoughtfully about the issues at hand. And the great thing about today's panelists is that they are all great, thoughtful, nuanced policy experts in this space. And I think we're going to get a great hour together. So I'm not going to spend much time introducing the panelists, and I'll ask them to say a word about themselves as we go across the issues. We'll spend about 40 minutes or so airing out some of these issues. We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, for other issues that the panelists would like to speak about. So why don't we start with the first issue, which has to do, that we want to talk about, which is funding. I think a group of state legislators and staff would be surprised that funding is an issue in this policy area. It's probably the only one where money ever comes up. Elections nationwide cost between $2 and $5 billion to administer every presidential election. So it's a lot of money. I mean, billions a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money from the perspective of everything government does, but still it's significant. There's a number of issues here that we can talk about: the amounts of money, who funds it, what does the money go for, and so this is an issue that is a perennial on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's been some specific issues that have come up, particularly in the context of the 2020 election and afterwards. And so we'll start there, and Chad, you can kick it off. And I've asked actually all of the panelists to say a word about, introduce themselves very briefly, and so we will hold them to the brief part, and then to jump into the discussion. So Chad, thanks.
Hopefully.
Do we need to turn on the microphone doesn't appear to be on? Hold on.
Is that it? Kind of. Getting some yeses, some no's.
It's not it. Can we try that one and see if it's working?
Test, is this one working? No. Well,
So Chad, why don't you come up here?
I can come to the podium.
Here. And I'll
Great.
figure out how to get this.
Thanks.
Excellent, thanks.
Well, I feel much more formal holding the microphone. But, hey, I'm Chad Ennis. I'm a vice president with the Honest Elections Project. We're a group that promotes fair, accountable, and transparent elections in whatever way we can. We have model bills. We have all kinds of resources for y'all to do that. You know, mainly, I always say our goal is to make sure that when an election's over, the loser says, I lost because I ran a worse campaign, not because I got messed by the rules. My background, I come from Texas. No applause. Come on. I'm from Texas. I worked with the Texas Secretary of State's office as the first director of their audit division. And before that, I was with Texas Public Policy Foundation. You know, we talk about funding of elections. You know, I think there's the basic money comes from the counties in Texas and other states, and also we have money that comes from legislature in many cases, and in some cases from the feds as well. One thing we've seen over the years that we think is a problem for transparency and accountability is the pervasiveness of now outside funding of election offices. And a lot of you are saying, oh, that was Zuckbucks in 2020, and there are like 24 or 26 states have used, like, we passed a law to get rid of that, right? And what we've seen is that folks won't be deterred that easily, and that their methods have morphed. And it went from, we're going to donate directly to election offices, to we're going to create a membership program that gets you all these benefits instead of just donating directly to you. So it's an end run around the bar on donations. And why is that important? Well, for one, we think outside funding of election administration, how you run an election, just reeks of potential for impropriety. We saw in 2020 that a lot of the money was targeted to certain jurisdictions in order to basically help get out the vote. And now we're seeing the same thing happen in 2022 and 2024. We think that's wrong. I think any outside funding, I always put it this way, take it out of elections. Would you want the NRA funding the permitting process for guns in a county? That seems like that wouldn't be too good. Or a pro-life or pro-abortion group funding health and human services in a county in your state, that seems problematic as well and could certainly lead to problems. So we want to keep that money out of elections. It's also become a conduit to bring in money from even foreign actors. So we've seen that a lot of these groups that are donating directly to local election administrators are actually conduits for foreign funding. And you can see that. We have a report that I believe is in your materials. If not, it's on honestelections.org, where you can see the emails and the receipts and the filings that show all of this. So with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of this crew. And
Maybe,
let them
just
comment.
why don't we go down the line, since we may be microphone restricted here.
Great. Hi, everyone. So nice to be here. My name is Rachel Ori. I am a Senior Associate Director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So the Bipartisan Policy Center is a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. We work across a number of different policy areas: economic policy, immigration, infrastructure, and I get to lead our elections project. Our primary motivation is to connect the voices of election administrators, those who are responsible for running elections at the state, local, county level, with the policymaking process. We think policy is incomplete if it doesn't consider the very real implementation hurdles that election officials face when putting policy into action. So you can find us. We have a booth in the exhibit hall if you want to come talk to us more. But to pick up on where Chad left off, we completely agree that elections are a governmental function and they should be funded accordingly. But at the same time, the reality of private funding in the 2020 election in particular revealed gaps in the current funding of election administration that we can't ignore. And so if states are going to restrict the use of private funding for election administration, which we do support, we think they have to take a careful look at where those gaps are in their current funding process. Because if you take away this source of funding that was critical in making sure that elections were secure in 2020, then you leave a big gap going into 2024. One other thing I'll say on funding is that, there's a lot of conversation, I'm sure we'll get there, about the need for federal funding. But, you all at the state level can't control when and if Congress is ever going to allocate the money that they should be supporting election administration with. But what you can do is remove the hurdles to using that funding from the federal government. A lot of states require that federal funding to be, approved through the legislative process, which ends up really slowing it down. So trying to remove those barriers to the use of funding would go a long way toward making sure that, state and local election officials have the resources they need to run elections. And I'll pass it to Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz Howard. I'm a former election official and currently the Deputy Director at the Brennan Center for Justice. We're an independent, nonpartisan law and policy organization that works to reform, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our country's system of democracy. We consider ourselves an action tank, so not only do we develop policies that we think can address some of the concerns that we're all facing, but we also work to promote those solutions. In response to what Chad and Rachel were talking about, I think that we all agree that outside funding of our elections is not ideal. However, the ultimate answer can't be that our voters and our election officials go without. These laws that have been passed have not been coupled, that I'm aware of, with mandatory minimum funding for our elections. And I think that, again, we all agree that our election officials have been and remain very under-resourced. And it is critical that the people in this room take steps to address that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Germer. I am the Associate Director and Fellow in the Governance Program at the R Street Institute. R Street is a DC-based think tank, but I get to enjoy the privilege now in our kind of post-pandemic world of working out of my home in North Carolina as opposed to having to live in the DMV area, thank goodness. R Street is a center-right think tank. We are focused on free markets and limited government. Our tagline is free markets and real solutions, which often means that we are taking our principles and applying them as best we can to the facts on the ground, as opposed to living in an ideal world where we could really control everything. Instead, we say, how can we solve the problems in front of us? I get to enjoy working on elections issues and focusing on election law across the country, which includes, as we look at it, reducing the amount of red tape in the process and making sure that there isn't really a barrier between voters and their ballots, but at the same time that the process itself is trustworthy, and that we have elections that produce concrete, solid, and outcomes that are worthy of public trust. We also look at electoral incentives that are created by the laws, although I think that's a little bit outside of our discussion here today. On the topic of election funding, this is something I think that Professor Stewart has brought up now, that there is actually quite a bit of agreement on the panel. And I think this is one of those issues where we might have uniform agreement in that private funding of elections is not really how this system was designed. And actually, to take a moment to talk about how that system is designed, I guess my contribution to the election funding discussion would be around the the structure of funding. It's my ardent belief that elections must be the purview of the states, not the federal government. States really should take ownership of funding elections. We hear from counties across the country that they feel and can prove that they are underfunded in the work that they are trying to do. Often that then turns the conversation to Uncle Sam and asking for money to come from DC to help fund the counties. I think that's a mistake. I think that funding should come from the states and state budget writers. If you're in the room, take note. I know everyone asks for money. That's everyone's solution to every problem is more money. But this is a vital government service up there with law enforcement and fire and all the rest. Elections are really the bedrock of our democracy. It's what makes us a democracy and needs to be funded accordingly. With that in mind, I do want to mention this might be one of those areas in which our panel has a bit of disagreement is in that role of federal funding. I do think there is a role for federal funding. Our states are paying for federal elections, which really means that the federal government is either getting a free service from the states or they should be ponying up for it. I think to the extent that the feds are involved, it should be limited to what I could think of as capital expenses, one-time purchases, updates in technology. Decisions then that ultimately come back to the states as to whether or not they want to accept the strings that come along with that money, as opposed to being hooked on ongoing funding from the federal government in a way that makes it very difficult to say no to those strings. So I would encourage, I don't know that we have federal lawmakers in the room, but I would encourage those federal lawmakers to fund elections, set aside money to be spent at the state and county level to make sure that our elections technology is up to date and that we have those hardware solutions that we need, but that to encourage the states to really take ownership of those operating expenses for elections and to be in contact with their counties.
Great, and we're running on time, and I think we actually might have the microphones back, so that'll be tested empirically just in a second. A couple of things. So as the moderator, I get to say one word on this. I'm not of substance, but about a year ago, I wrote a report on the issue of funding, and I think we have it available, some copies here and on the app for people who want to look at it, which lays out the issues. It's not an advocacy piece, but it lays out the issues. It's mostly aimed at issues of federal funding, but it also raises this issue about what levels and different models. And also, as with all of these issues, I believe I know on this one, on the NCSL website, there's a very good web page about issues of funding, particularly models of supplying funds for elections. Most localities get their funds through general revenues at the county level, but there's some very creative ways of creating dedicated sources to funding elections as well. So encourage y'all to take a look at those resources. Moving on very rapidly, we're cranking ahead. We're going to talk about the workforce now. And by the workforce, we mean workforce at kind of the top of organizations, particularly in counties or local jurisdictions that are running elections, but also the poll workers. So a couple of just facts to keep in mind as we're talking about that workforce. First of all, there's roughly 10,000 local jurisdictions in the United States that run elections. All of them have at least one person in charge. Most of them only have one person in charge doing many things, but a number of very large jurisdictions can have hundreds of people working for those county offices. There are also people who staff the polling places on kind of seasonal labor, if you will. And in an election, roughly 1 million people, think about that, 1 million people show up on election day or during the early voting period to help voters vote. So this is not a small workforce, and it's a very critical workforce where there's a number of issues. You can see a few up here having to do with the recruitment, retention, and training of people who help to staff democracy and make the elections work. And we'll start with I know Rachel has some thoughts about this, so we'll start with her.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. So if you're following the elections track over the next couple days, I'm sure this is going to be the first of hundreds of times that workforce is mentioned, and I think it's going to be a cornerstone for years to come in the elections field. For those of you who aren't kind of in the election space all the time, we hear stat after stat of the alarming rates of turnover that is being witnessed within state and local election administration. In North Carolina, those responsible for administering elections at the county level, they've seen 50% turnover of those county election directors since 2020. Kansas has seen nearly 75%. And this is a trend that we're seeing across the country. So as we go into the 2024 election, we're going to have huge amounts of the election workforce, and it's going to be their first time administering a high turnout presidential election. And these are alarming statistics because turnover itself is a risk to the security and integrity of our election process. Elections are no easy job, and to be administering a high turnout election for the first time requires resources, training, and support. And so when faced with these pretty alarming statistics, the first question most people ask is, okay, how do we stop the turnover? And I think that's a fine place to start. You know, we should be making elections better places to work for the people currently there. But the question I like to ask is, how can we make election administration resilient to periods of high turnover? And there are a couple key ways to do that. The first is through preserving institutional knowledge. If you ask a new county election official, typically the way that they get their questions answered is they pick up the phone, they call one of their neighboring county election directors who's been there for years and who can answer it no problem. That works really well when you have lots of people who have been there for a long time. It doesn't work as well when you have 75% of the county election directors in the state who are brand new. So you can preserve that institutional knowledge through robust state associations, through creating strong training programs, and through jumpstart programs for new election officials. The other way is through creating a sustainable talent pipeline, making sure that when there is that turnover in election administration, we have people who can fill the gaps. Thankfully, a lot of the solutions for creating that pipeline also help retain the folks that are already there. That's doing things like making sure election officials are paid well. Election officials are typically paid really low compared to other officials in local or county government. So taking a look at how those roles are classified to make sure they're being compensated fairly. And that will also help recruit new people into the field in the long term. So I'll pass it off to Liz, but I'll just say that election officials really are the critical infrastructure of our election administration system, and so we need to support them, or else we risk the security and integrity of our process.
Thank you. I just want to talk a little bit about, in the context of workforce development, the 10,000 people that Charles mentioned who are responsible for running our elections at the local level. The typical election official is a 50 to 64-year-old woman who makes about $50,000 a year. She's recently been informed that she's responsible for protecting our election infrastructure against well-funded foreign adversaries. She could be one of the 3 local election officials who has reported being threatened, harassed, or abused for simply doing her job. And even if she has great benefits at her government job, including vacation, she may be unlikely or unable to take that vacation because, unlike me and unlike you, she can't get extensions on her responsibilities. Election day is coming no matter what. And being less than perfect at any one of the responsibilities that she has, which includes a cybersecurity expert, a master logistician, legal analyst, FOIA response bot, de-escalation expert, and a MacGyver. She's at danger of losing her job or having her entire family threatened. It is so incredibly important for us to invest in these public servants that are taking care of our democracy, and workforce development is a critical component of that. And I'll pass it off to Matt.
Thanks, Liz. I honestly want to echo what previous 2 speakers said. I think that what they've shared is the same perspective I hold as far as the importance of our election workers to the system itself. They are really the front line of a smooth election, a trustworthy election that the voters will ultimately accept, hopefully either way, regardless of how it turns out. One thing I guess I'll mention that's a bit distinct from what's been brought up already is the impact that changes in election policy can have on the workforce. I will admit myself, as someone who advocates for changes to election policy at various levels, that there's a certain amount of humility on my part that I need to grapple with a little more often about how the changes I'm proposing will impact the workforce. But changes to policy do impact the workforce. You're often asking these election workers that have been identified to redo entire processes that they've spent their career working on, often for good reason. But with that should come adequate funding and resources, time as best as possible to onboard these changes. I think one of the things as we head into the 24 cycle of legislation that we often see are changes in last-minute scrambles to try to change election policy just before an election without really enough time to come on board and let these things take meaningful effect. I also feel like I'd be remiss to my friends at the county level if I didn't mention that this often functions as an unfunded mandate. I know we just got done talking about funding, but changes to policy that don't always come with an obvious price tag have a price tag in the way they have to require changes in process and training. So keeping in mind the time for onboarding new policies, the funding provided for those policies can make life just a little smoother for those that are part of our elections workforce, which will help to reduce the discouragement they might be feeling conducting their jobs at the moment and help encourage them to stick around a little bit longer to know that they are supported.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what they said. Back on?
Yep.
There we go. I agree with a lot of what was said there, but I want to make a couple points. One, as far as what legislators can do, I mean, you mentioned seasonal work. I know one county in Texas wanted to hire 2,000, was only able to hire like 500, just because of not being able to, being tied by their county to being able to pay more to even maybe not get to 2,000, but maybe get to 1,500 by paying a few more bucks an hour. So cutting that red tape is always a good thing there. I think with our workforce, one thing we don't talk about enough is and we kind of touched on it, but just the burnout of it. We see states with 45 days of voting where that election administrator and official has to be on for 45 days. You see moves to get rid of, in Texas we have a Sunday off between early voting and between election day voting, Sunday and Monday actually. You see folks wanting to take those 2 days away, but those are important for our election administrators to recharge their batteries, get back into, get the machines reset up, make sure everything's going okay. You have voter registration that goes right up until election day. That is something that can be pushed back where it takes some of the strain off our election administrators. We've got laws and red tape that say, well, if you live in another county, you can't be a worker in another county. That's some more red tape that could be cut to ease some of this burden. And then again, we've also, and Matt touched on this a little, from the legislative side, but also from the litigation side. We've got lawsuits right up until the day of election, changing the rules right very close to the election. And that is about the worst thing that can happen. If you've ever met an election administrator, they are step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. If you change step 3 and they've already done that, they are not going to be happy, and it's going to lead to mistakes in poor election hygiene.
Great, thanks. And all of this, it reminds me of something that I oftentimes talk about whenever I speak to groups of state legislators, but also academics and people who advocate for reform. And it's that those of us who are outside of election administration oftentimes fall victim to what I call how hard could it be-ism. And I think that the panelists here are reflecting that for as important as the changes are oftentimes in policy, there needs to be consideration of who's implementing things. Running elections is hard. It's not easy, and considering the workforce implications of these changes is really important. So moving on to security, and just to introduce that a bit, in the old, so I'm among many things, I'm a historian of American politics, and I've studied the electoral system in the United States across its centuries-long history. And in the late 19th century, there were a number of court rulings and rulings in contested elections and legislatures around violence at the polling place. Back in the late 19th century, it was not uncommon. In fact, I'll put that positively. It was common to go up to a polling place to see mobs, to be, if you wanted to vote, to be, and you look like you might be voting for the other party, to be physically challenged, to be beat up on your way into the polls. And judges at the time and legislative committees considering a challenge to an election because of election violence. The doctrine that got promulgated in most states and in the United States Congress was if you were not physically robust enough to fight your way into a polling place, you had no business voting. And a number of the reforms around the turn of the 20th century were to make it safe to be in a polling place. And think about all the things now that we just take for granted. It's about physical safety in the polling place. Well, issues of safety and security have gotten to be much more complex now. We still have concerns about physical security, and unfortunately, they've been rising over the last few years, but we have a number of other issues as well. And rather than giving the talk myself, I'll turn it over to Liz, and she can get us going on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I mean, as he was suggesting, unfortunately, today's election officials must be prepared for all hazards. And that's going to include attacks from foreign adversaries and domestic bad actors. And this can come in the form of cyber threats. So it could include a distributed denial of service attack, such as what the Mississippi Secretary of State's office saw happen just this last election on November. In the November election, a DDoS attack took down his website. This can also take the form of the intrusions to our voter registration databases that we saw ahead of the 2016 election. Of course, physical security remains a top concern for many election officials, whether that's a mob at a polling location or something more personal. And actually, as we sit here today, we are just about 15 miles away from a man who was charged with threatening an election official on Friday of last week. Nearly 3 in 4 election officials say that threats against them have increased in recent years. And in good news, we have some clear steps that election officials can take to improve the resiliency against attack for their facilities and for their networks. Common sense solutions on the cyber side include using paper ballots and post-election audits, and some of the physical security improvements include putting in panic buttons, putting in bullet-resistant glass, and looking at your facilities to make sure that there are at least 2 exits. And in further good news, after 2017, when the DHS Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security designated election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, was able to offer free tools and resources to our election officials. These are going to include personalized assessments, where these officials will come to the election official's office and survey the equipment and the facilities and the networks that they have and provide customized recommendations for improvements. And even more good news, CISA Director Jen Easterly just announced last week, maybe 2 weeks ago now, that they are going to hire regional election security advisors to provide even more customized service to election officials. And of course, there's another big threat that's even trickier to combat, and that is going to be false information about our elections. And that impacts not only the election security piece of this, but also public trust and confidence in our elections. This is not a new problem. There's a great quote attributed to Mark Twain. I don't know if he actually said it, but a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. And that certainly applies today after the advent of social media and with the maturation of AI. These are significant concerns. And what we do know is that election officials cannot combat this false information by themselves. We all have a role to play, including the people in this room, which, as you've heard already, right, includes making sure that the election officials have the funding that they need, but I think it also includes, a responsibility on you to understand how your election systems work. And I won't ask for hands, but I do ask you to think about whether or not you know who your local election official is, and have you visited their office? Are you familiar with their facilities? Are you familiar with the equipment that they use? And I'll pass it off to Matt.
Thanks, Liz. I guess as I think of election security, there's a couple different categories, and we can see them on the slide. Cybersecurity, physical security. I know that when I think of those categories, they often get very siloed, but they all really connect. And the concepts of cybersecurity and physical security as well are not just about, they are about election workers and about making sure we have physical security for voters and making sure that we have cybersecurity insofar as we talk about information around elections, but it's also, we need physical and cybersecurity for the ballots themselves and for election data. Ultimately, as Liz touched on toward the end, this is about making sure that the counts are accurate, making sure that workers and voters are protected, but ultimately that there's public trust. That's really more of an indirect impact of any cyber or physical security event. I may not be the one who was personally threatened, but I feel less confident in the electoral outcome if I know that others are being threatened as part of the process. I may not be the one who came across, or whose data was hacked, or who my county's election data was subject to a DDoS attack or something like that, but I have less confidence in the total outcome as a result. It's so difficult, and as was reflected at the beginning of this, so complex to try to take care of cyber and physical security across all of those different factors, but it's absolutely vital. And it's, these issues really do touch on one another: funding, workforce, security, to make sure that at the end of the day, voters have something they can trust. And I guess the last piece I'll mention, and Liz hasn't mentioned it, but R Street has worked with the Brennan Center and a few other partners on the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. Am I doing the order right? You can find our website at safeelections.org. We help to connect law enforcement agencies with counties, election departments, in order to make sure that they are coordinating with each other in advance of elections, so that there are processes in place in the event of a threat, and that election officials know who to turn to. And they know what the law is, and they know the extent to which that law can and should be enforced when those circumstances are in advance of an event occurring. So I wanted to take a moment to encourage folks who haven't explored this to visit safeelections.org.
Well, I think there's probably, everyone agrees in this entire room that cybersecurity should be of utmost importance. We need to make sure that our election systems are safe. Yeah, I think on the poll worker security, I get a lot, when we try to say about election fraud that it doesn't exist, we get that constantly. And there is much less data to support that our workers are under siege than there is to support that there's voter fraud. I think what we've done a lot of times is put the word harassment in, we substitute that for criticism. When I was working at the Secretary of State's office, I was not immune to criticism. In fact, I got a lot of criticism, a lot. What I should be immune from is harassment. And I was never harassed. People would call my office and tell me I was wrong, tell me I was doing things wrong, but no one showed up at my house or anything like that. So I think we need to separate and make sure we allow workers to be criticized and to be watched. And I've told election administrators all over, everywhere I can, look, scrutiny of you has become huge. Back in 1998, you weren't under a lot of scrutiny. Now you are. And you've got to show your work. You've got to show that you're doing what's right, because most of you are, and show the public, and you won't be subject to criticism. You'll still get criticism, but 90% of the people, 95% of the people will say, bah, that's worthless. But I still, cybersecurity, I think we all agree. Funding for that from the state level, working with different agencies, putting the agencies that have the expertise in that with your Secretary of State, with other groups, with your counties, to make sure that data is tight and protected is of utmost importance.
Thanks so much, Chad. I think I agree with most of what's been said so far. I think I will briefly comment on the criticism versus harassment. I think there is maybe an increase in both, and I would be careful not to dismiss the reality that many of the election officials I know personally have been, had to evacuate their homes because they have armed folks outside protesting. They've been, threatened that their heads will go on spikes. So I think we need to be careful in distinguishing the two. And at the same time, better equipping election offices to respond to increased demands for transparency. Transparency is a core component of a legitimate democratic process, but complete and unfettered transparency can sometimes backfire when you have a 24-hour live streaming of a voting site and a small clip of a poll worker updating or bringing in ballots can go viral and make it seem like fraud was taking place when it wasn't. So finding a way to walk that line between educating voters about what's actually happening in an election site and being able to push back against those kinds of trends that misrepresent what's actually happening with an election administration. I think one way to do that is through a very strong audit process, particularly before certification. If you have an audit after results are certified, it makes it a little bit more difficult to act on any discrepancies that might come up. So really having those strong pre-certification audits and protecting election workers and making sure that they feel safe to do their job and that voters feel safe in the polling place as well.
Great. And actually, so Rachel mentioned something right at the end about policy that really is at the state level for state legislators to think about, and it has to do with the timing of auditing and certification. And many election officials would like to do more robust post-election tabulation audits, but find that they are really crunched by the certification deadlines. And so that's one area where it seems to be a lot of interest, my observation, from election officials who would like to be more transparent, would like to be able to catch errors before they get ensconced in the certified results. And so that's a little thing that, it's not a little thing, but it is a thing that we y'all might want to pay attention to. So let's turn to the last kind of formal matter on the agenda, which is list maintenance. To vote in the United States, in every state except one, North Dakota, you have to be registered. Registering in the United States is particularly challenging for a couple of reasons. And one of the big reasons is our mobility. Between every presidential election, roughly 45% of Americans move, and we aren't required to tell anybody that we've moved. And most voters believe that when they move, their registration follows them. And so, keeping the voting rolls clean is a challenge. During that same period, about 5% of the 4-year period, about 5% of voters will die, but we generate a lot of paperwork when we die. You will, I will. So it's easier to follow dead people and get them off the rolls than movers. But keep in mind that movers are about 10 times more than dyers. And that's a big change. I mean, that's a big challenge in getting people, in getting those rolls, clean for the administration of elections, which has to do with efficiency, protection against fraud, and the rest. And so I will start this round with Matt to talk about list maintenance.
Thank you. So this is a subject that has become more and more prevalent in the news and on the minds of state legislators as the discussion over organization ERIC really has hit a number of states. This is the Electronic Registration Information Center. Did I get that right? All right. Who have been at their peak, I think 35 states or so, plus DC, were members of this organization to share voter registration information across state lines to ensure that voters aren't registered improperly in multiple jurisdictions. As was referenced, I think something just short of 10% of Americans will move out of state between elections, and I'm one of them. In the last handful of presidential elections, actually just in the last 10 years, I've moved between 4 states myself and had to handle the re-registration problems there. And very often it's easy to register in your new state and difficult to unregister in your old state. I can speak most recently, I moved from Washington State, where I served as staff in the House of Representatives, to North Carolina, where I live now. To get off the voter rolls in Washington State, I had to print out, fill out a form, sign it, and mail it back to the state of Washington. To be honest with you, I wasn't very interested in doing that. It was a lot of steps, and I could hardly imagine most people would take the time to even Google that step in the first place. So we end up with a lot of duplicate registrations across the country. Fortunately, most Americans, I think, are not the type to vote in both jurisdictions, but they could, particularly if there's someone like me who came from a state like Washington that relies heavily on vote by mail. If we want to live in a world in which vote by mail is available to voters, whether it's for all voters or for no excuse absentee, or even for absentee voters who just prefer to vote that way and fall within one of the excuses, clean voter rolls are a must. We don't want our counties wasting money sending out voter and election materials to people who don't live in their jurisdiction anymore, particularly if they live out of state, because now they're not really valid on any parts of the ballot or those materials. That's where an organization like ERIC really provided value. I say provided because unfortunately, as a result of state legislation over the last few months, I think we're down to just about half of the states of the union now belonging to ERIC. In my perspective, ERIC provides a valuable service to states. I know that there has been some controversy over what those requirements might be for states. I think there's a requirement that states affirmatively reach out to unregistered voters to ask them to register. That's something that, to me, I don't necessarily see as a burden not worth overcoming. And in fact, I think the right way forward should have been for states frustrated with their perceptions of ERIC to go back to ERIC and reform ERIC. Instead, what we've seen are a number of states throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, because what makes an organization like ERIC particularly valuable is the number of states that belong to it, the fact that it was a coalition of both red and blue states. I encourage the states that are deciding they don't want to be a part of ERIC, or either no longer want to be a part or no longer wish to join, to really contemplate what the alternative will be. This isn't to say ERIC will necessarily be a one-of-a-kind organization that could never exist again. I will grant it is possible to set up an alternative to ERIC, but I really encourage the states that are outside of ERIC at this point to think deeply about what they're going to do to replace the services it provides, because those services are valuable. And I look forward to what that solution might be in the future, because it is an important service, and list maintenance is a must as we continue to move toward a future that seems to have more and more absentee voting.
Chad?
Yeah, I mean, list maintenance and voter registration is, the first step in an election and having a good, clean election. With respect to ERIC, ERIC was a kind of red-blue organization, but yet, California and New York never joined. Their data was not in there. I think one of the things that they looked at in Texas when Texas got out was, it's a bit of a cost-benefit analysis. We've been talking about funding of elections, and it was extraordinarily expensive to send all these mailers out to unregistered voters. And really the data Texas was getting back wasn't really knocking a whole lot of voters off the voter rolls. Deaths come from counties, come up to the state anyway. In-state moves come to the state. So that was kind of the cost-benefit analysis that Texas did and said, maybe we can do better on our own. I think the other problem when you look at list maintenance is, in ERIC in particular, is that a lot of the states that were involved weren't and still aren't using the data. Every time someone tries to do a removal of folks from voter rolls, the state gets sued. Wisconsin's been sued, Texas has been sued, all the states have been sued for this that try to do voter list maintenance. So you get this data from ERIC, and man, I'd like to really to clean up my voter rolls, and then we're going to do it, and then boom, there's a lawsuit, and you're not doing it. And all you're doing is sending out mailers, but not getting the benefits of clean voter rolls. In member state Michigan, which we sued from Honest Elections Project, we sued them. They had we had to get sued to get 177,000 folks removed from the voter rolls. They're an ERIC member. They were getting all the data from ERIC, still weren't cleaning their voter rolls. So definitely for clean voter rolls, ERIC is useful in parts, but the states have to use it. And if you're still a member state, you should require your Secretary of State or whoever handles your voter rolls to actually utilize the data.
Thank you. So I think I'll piggyback on a couple of different points that were made here. The first, Matt's point about ERIC working best when there are more states present. California is in the process of joining, which will be a huge influx of data to the program, but it really costs a lot of money and time to develop an alternative to ERIC. Not that it's not possible, but when you have 2 or 3 different systems operating across the country, it makes it hard for an interstate data sharing program to live up to its full potential. Right now, the more states that are present, it's easier to catch those fraudulent instances of double voting that are few and far between, but they do exist, and ERIC right now is one of the only tools available through which we can catch it. Additionally, ERIC does, depending on what state laws are around list maintenance, provide lower cost data to states. I would just urge the state legislators in the room to look at what their policies are for how ERIC data can be utilized. Some states make it, depends secretary to secretary how those reports from ERIC are utilized. That does make it harder for county officials to really act on the data they receive. So potentially reducing some of those barriers to effective list maintenance so that states can better utilize the huge amount of data that ERIC does provide. And I also want to add that ERIC isn't the only thing happening in list maintenance. There are other ways to make voter registration more accurate. Things like online and automatic voter registration not only help make sure that voters can get registered seamlessly, but they make lists more accurate. Some states still don't have online voter registration, which means election officials are often hand inputting, paper written registration forms. And if you've ever tried to transcribe someone's handwriting, you can imagine there's lots of errors involved. So there are other ways to make sure that our lists are accurate and robust, in addition to sharing data across states.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll just add that we used ERIC when I was the Deputy Commissioner of Elections in Virginia, and it worked well. And our local election officials were appreciative of the quality of data that they received, because in Virginia, it was up to the local election officials to make the final determination about who was going to be removed from those roles. And the ERIC data gave them confidence that what they were doing was appropriate. So, it may be, there may be reasonable complaints about ERIC, but again, from the local level and from the state level, it worked well.
Okay. Well, we have other things that we can talk about, and we'll talk about. But I think we've reached a point where the audience has been generous enough, and they haven't rioted or anything like that. And I'm sure some of them have questions. And so, what questions or comments do members of the audience have?
We do need to ask you to come up to one of the mics because this is being live streamed, and while I'm waiting for Richard to come up, I want to say that this afternoon we have safeguarding public safety Kelly from. Here I am talking right into it.
There you
but
are.
it's not
We got it.
Okay, let's try again. Okay, so this afternoon, 1:30 to 2:30, Safeguarding Public Servants. Neil Kelly, who is from the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which got mentioned earlier, will be talking about the work that his committee is doing on protecting election workers.
Just a comment to put a finer point on Ms. Howard's reference to free CISA security. We don't appreciate free. For a mid-sized county, 50 to 75 population, K population, if you hired that out, it's worth about $125,000 to $150,000. So not only are you giving up the free, you're laying that money on the table. So this is a free service that they're providing, but it has a value. And I don't think we state that enough. My only other comment is I get to talk with a lot of local government election clerks, and the one question I always ask, the people that are on your ballot at the state and the federal level, do you know them? Have they ever come in and shaken your hand? And 9 out of 10 say no. So I encourage everybody here at the state level, at the federal level, go shake their hand. Figure out what they do day to day.
Great, thanks. And Liz, just to remind the audience, Richard made reference to the CISA tools. Can you just really quickly remind folks what you were referring to there?
Yes, CISA also offers a suite of free resources. Two that many election officials have found very valuable include a cybersecurity assessment, where again they will come in and do an analysis of your networks and identify some improvements that you can make to make your system more resilient against attack. Separately, and what a lot of election officials have really been focused on recently has to do with the physical security assessment. They call it a safe assessment. And so they will come in and, again, provide customized recommendations for your specific space, which may include putting up bullet-resistant glass. It may include panic buttons. And again, I think, like I said earlier, looking at your facility to make sure that there are 2 exits.
Great, thanks. Please.
Curious for the panelists to discuss. What do you say to people that claim that counting votes by hand is better than machine counting?
I say watch somebody hand count votes and then say if you still agree with that. Look, people in this country have been cheating on hand counting ballots in elections since the beginning of the Republic. Folks know how to do this. If you handed us all the same ballots and had us all count them by hand, we're all going to get a different number. Guaranteed. And to think we're going to count by hand, I'm thinking of a county in Texas, Harris. They have their problems anyway. But 3 million people in Harris County, a ballot that usually has about 20 races on it. You're going to count all of those by hand this year? I think not. No way. So that would be my answer.
Can I add one thing in defense of hand count? Actually, not really in defense of hand. Really, actually, though, there is a role for a time for hands to touch a ballot, and that can come for certain audit and recount procedures, because machines are also not perfect, as we all know, and the way that we fill out ballots often can be misread by machines. So there might come a moment in a narrow circumstance for the use of human eyes and hands to touch and observe ballots to take a more accurate count, but not for dozens of races across millions of voters. It's just completely impractical and also error prone. I mean, we are all human, and error is human.
Anything to add? Or they were good. Yeah, I've actually done some of the academic research on this, and the academic research confirms this. The way that I like to explain it is that human beings are really bad at tedious, boring things. And if you want something that's tedious and boring, that's counting ballots. Computers are really good at tedious, boring things. And hopefully we can come back to the auditing later on, because that's a really important point as well.
Hi, I'm Grace Gordon with the Bipartisan Policy Center. And I'm wondering if the panelists can speak a little bit to, if I'm a state legislator and I'm looking to gather different perspectives and look sort of across states for good election policy, how do you recommend that I would do that? And can you talk a little bit about the resources that exist to sort of compare election policies across states? Maybe this is an NCSL plug a little bit. But yeah, that's my question.
I can kick us off briefly. So, we're all at the NCSL Summit. NCSL actually kind of collects and presents some of the most comprehensive data on election policies across states, so I highly recommend you checking out all of their resources. Also a shameless plug for the Bipartisan Policy Center. We have a number of election official endorsed reports on everything from audits to observers and challengers to electronic ballot transmission to workforce. So if you're looking to get in touch, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, another resource is Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia? Is there an O in there? Ballotpedia. They collect all the stuff y'all are filing across the country with respect to elections, and you can see what people are doing in other states. Heritage Foundation's election scorecard is really good. You can see where your state stacks up as far as election security. It's another good resource.
Great. Anyone else?
Yes, +1 to the recommendation to look at NCSL data. It's certainly something that I look at and I encourage others to look at on a variety of measures. It's such a great, incredible resource. But of course, also at Brennan, we review various election administration policies across the country and put out reports on a very frequent basis about what we think are good policy options to address some of the serious concerns facing our democracy right now.
So to make it, a clean sweep in favor of NCSL, I'll say as former legislative staff, NCSL was the first place I turned when I was looking for what other states were doing to get some ideas for what my state could be doing. And to this day, it's still the first place I go when I'm looking for a 50-state survey or an easy way to find state statutes on the same subject across multiple states. Absolutely love the work NCSL does. I will endorse many of the others' contributions on this topic. I guess I will also note, and perhaps because she's joining me today, but R Street has worked at the Bipartisan Policy Center in the past on this type of issue. In fact, a couple of years ago, we were taking a frame on federal election reform, considering that there really isn't a pathway forward for federal election reform, and instead looked toward a model in which states would implement various changes and maintain control over their own elections. And we conducted a survey largely of electoral policy across the states, seeing where there's gaps and what states can improve. Forgive me for misremembering, I think now the title of that report, I think it's something like Achieving Bipartisan Election Reform. If you Google R Street and the Bipartisan Policy Center and elections, you will probably come across our wonderful report now from a couple of years ago.
Great. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Guy Camilleri from Tennessee. Going back to, you guys were talking about Eric earlier. From everything I've studied over the past few years, it's probably the best tool nationally, interstate tool to keep voter rolls clean, prevent fraud, et cetera. The recent exodus of all these states from Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think almost all of them are Republican-controlled states. Do you guys have any theory or idea as to why the exodus has been so lopsided?
Chad, you want to?
I'm happy to go.
Well, there are several things. I think there were some efforts to reform ERIC from the inside that some of the Republican states did not feel were fruitful enough to keep them in. I think the cost, at least, was a big thing in Texas. Sending out mailer and the rigidness, because it's not that we don't want to reach unregistered people. It's maybe a mailer is not the best way. Can we do something else? No. So I think, we're spending all this money on a system that I think everyone agreed doesn't register anyone, because you get a card, okay, I'm not registered, so what? So I think that drove some, and I think there was some, there's been some concern with ERIC not being transparent enough with the way they were handling data. I don't know if those are necessarily justified, but I think the concerns were out there, and I don't think that they were dealt with in a way that made people feel good about it.
Anybody else?
Just want to briefly reflect that, ERIC is a member-run organization, and it's run by the states who are present in it, and many of the states who left before a vote that was made to reform some of ERIC's policies. So they actually missed out on an opportunity to address some of the concerns that they had around those. There was a big controversy around the eligible but unregistered voters. But I think really a lot of the withdrawals came down to a kind of a public campaign that was targeted at certain states, and it's unfortunate because, as we've already discussed, when less states are present, the program isn't as effective as it could be with more member states.
I guess I'll chip in and maybe be a little bit more explicit from what I understand to be the concern, which is a series of viral stories on the Gateway Pundit that sparked grassroots support on the right, to tell folks to show up to their town halls and tell their legislators to get out of ERIC. The concern brought forward by the Gateway Pundit had to do with ERIC sharing data with left-leaning organizations to promote voter registration among potentially left-leaning voters. Whether those were justified accusations or not, I think that some folks from ERIC are here, and they'd probably be happy to talk to you about the experience that they went through. But manifestly, I think really what it was a series of posts online, and that sparked kind of a grassroots opposition to ERIC.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Matt said, the ERIC executive director is here at this conference. If you have questions and want actual information and facts, talk to him.
Yes.
Right there.
Good. Hand up, right there. Standing up. Shane Hanlon. All right. Next question. And by the way, I'm noticing that we're actually, the number of people in line and the amount of time we have, it's not going to work. So let's do this. If folks can ask their questions, and then I'll open it up to the panel for one last time to kind of please respond to the questions. If we can work in other things that you might want to bring up, do that as well. Is that okay? So go.
All right. Thank you all for being here today. It's been very informative. I wanted to pick up on a couple of themes that were talked about of the audit and the timing of the certification, and then Rachel talked about transparency and balancing that. And so an issue that's come up in my state is the release of the unofficial results, and that people wanting that information instantaneously, election administrators being concerned about wanting to verify it, and then if they take a little bit of time to release that information, people being concerned about the job that they're doing and they're hiding something. And so I was wondering if you could just comment on that, of ways to address that.
Okay, so unofficial results. And what state are you from?
Montana.
Montana. And if folks could identify themselves when they come up, so that would be helpful. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Barbara Smith-Warner with the National Vote at Home Institute, and I was just going to throw out any comments on voting at home as a way to increase turnout, because not only I'm from Oregon, where indeed in 22, we're the longest serving vote at home state, where we are constantly in the top 3, but also overall a number of reports that have come out recently about the 22 election. It wasn't just the bleep in the 2020 election, but that there is an increase in vote at home, first of all, and also it has a significant boost to turnout. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, State Representative Pat Boy from Indiana. I had a question. Has anyone ever considered having a public service announcement nationwide about, if you've moved recently, have you removed yourself from your other state, and have a downloadable form for that? Because you can't do it if they don't give your signature. And if there's a form that they can do it on, it would make it a lot clearer for how to remove people from roles, rather than waiting 10 years and not getting any mails back. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Please.
Thank you. Kevin Johnson from Election Reformers Network. A question about recruiting and about the general theme of professionalization of election work, which I think we all recognize is a really great and important development. To what extent do you see is recruiting hindered by state requirements of bipartisan pairs for poll workers?
Representative Emma Greenman from Minnesota, and it feels like one of the pieces, especially when we're talking about security, when we're talking about workforce, that we've been hinting at but really haven't said is not just the curing the symptoms with the policy, but actually looking at the disease and what's happened since 2020, and why, when we talk to our election administrators, what they're feeling with that change in culture. And I will say, sort of with the Taylor Swift, like, hey, me, I'm the problem, it's me, like, what are elected officials? How are we part of the problem and the solution in terms of how we're dealing with the 2020 and beyond problem?
Great, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Susanna Danji from South Africa, Northwest Province. I'm aware that our political systems are not the same. But coming here, sometimes we tend to share some experiences. So listening to the panelists, I was more interested on political party funding system in these different countries, transparency, party registration, especially on campaigns, on how is it regulated in your states. Because one of the panelists also raised the issue that sometimes it's not easy to change your registration in another state. Now, my question will be, all these things, is it not legislated or regulated by the body that governs elections in some of the states? Because our system in South Africa, we have an election body called the IEC that governs all the processes towards elections. So some of these challenges are easy to be dealt there. And in terms of transparency, this political party system is compulsory for all the parties to declare whatever donations that they've received in terms of elections. The last part is in terms of, I did not hear you mentioning it, the youth participation and interest in elections. How is it this? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of issues here, so this is going to be the lightning round, and I know, and what I'm going to do is just I'm going to start with Chad and go down the line, and please engage in the questions and the issues that were raised, but then on top of that, the voices in your own head, and the other issues that you would like to take us out on.
You really don't want to go with the voices in my head. I'll try to tick some of these off. On unofficial results, I think the key with that and what we need to be doing is, allow pre-processing of mail-in ballots and in provisional ballots and those kind of things, where we can get most of the results done on election night. Also shorten your period for accepting mail-in ballots. We've got states that will accept them 2-3 weeks after the election. You watch the votes change 2-3 weeks after the election. That is not a recipe for faith in elections. That's a recipe for people going, what the heck? Voting at home, I mean, I don't like it for just one of the problems I just said right there, but I also think there's a civic pride in showing up at the polling place and casting your ballot if you're able. Of course, we want our disabled voters and sick and in jail in some cases to be able to vote, but I think there's a civic benefit to showing up and voting in person. The PSA thing I love. If we can get people who move to take themselves off voter rolls, that'd be great. As Matt said earlier, I think the problem is in a lot of our states, if not most all of our states, it's really hard to get off the voter rolls unless they get the data from somewhere else. Recruiting, one thing I've heard, the bipartisan pairs, I don't know if that's a problem. I've seen it may be for some of these folks. But one thing I've seen is in some locales, the parties themselves control who's an election judge, and sometimes it's really hard to get rid of a bad one because the parties control it. So I think, giving some power to your election administrators at the local level to say, hey, look, this person screws up every time, every election, they're done here, would be a good thing. As far as my pet project, what's bouncing around in my head, I come from Texas, where I started the audit division in there, and that wasn't just checking the counts, which we do in 2 ways in Texas, a risk limiting audit and a hand count we call a partial manual count, where you count a portion of the ballots, but also full process procedural audits. I think it's really important for our election administrators to, just like when you're doing a 6th grade math project, you show your work. You don't just pop out the answer. You show your work. And that's what we did in Texas. We took 4 counties. We said, let's look at what you're doing. Are you following processes? Because if in most states, almost all states, if you're following the processes that you guys have laid out for the counties and jurisdictions to follow, if they're following those processes, they're going to get a good election. And they're going to have results you can trust. So a little accountability, a little transparency, I think goes a long way and will help a lot.
All right, I will be very brief. On the recruitment for bipartisan pairs, many states don't strictly require bipartisan pairs, but they require that election officials strive for parity whenever possible. So we support that kind of little bit of wiggle room. And research has shown that talking about the bipartisan nature of election administration is one of the key aspects of building voter trust. So I would try and balance out those two recruitment versus trust needs. Additionally, totally support pre-processing. BPC recommends at least 7 days of pre-processing, depending on the jurisdiction. And then I believe Emma, I don't remember the last name, but asked about, getting at the disease and not just the symptoms. I think that's a disease that election officials can't solve alone. And especially when it comes to issues of public trust, I think research has shown that it's often, political elites who are the source of a lot of distrust. So when there are those long periods after Election Day, even if you do have pre-processing in close jurisdictions, it's going to take time. Being the one that's upfront with voters, endorsing your own trust in the system and trying to cultivate it there, I think would go a long way.
Just a big picture comment about many of the solutions that we're talking about today, whether it be additional audits, changing the timing of pre-processing, getting assessments done, right? And implementing the recommendations, doing the PSAs. None of this is free. Our election officials need resources to take all of these steps. And in large measure, that is going to start with you. I also want to plug Brennan. We've done a lot of work on focusing on the safety of election officials. Rutgers is worried about your safety and the safety at your workplace. So I hope that you will consider taking a quick survey that you can find on this QR code so that people can do some research into what's going to be helpful to you as we look ahead in this challenging circumstances.
All right, so I have the pleasure of batting cleanup here on all of the questions. I don't know that I'm going to be able to get to them. I don't know that I will even try. A couple of things I guess really stick out to me because they are both brought up in the discussion as well as things that are on my mind at the moment, and this has to do with absentee ballots and voting from home. I am somebody who personally loves voting from home. Like, I would prefer to vote from home myself. I like having my computer in front of me, being able to look up candidates and issues, take notes. Especially these, and now that I live in North Carolina, which does not offer a readily accessible voter's guide, I have no idea who these candidates are, and the best I can do is find a Facebook page, maybe, which is just wildly frustrating. But I love voting from home. That said, I think I am personally frustrated when elections feel like they drag out because ballots are only have to be postmarked by Election Day, and they can continue to arrive days after the election. I think that that's not only unhealthy for me, the spectator, but it is unhealthy for us as a voting culture. It provides this window for misinformation and really just lies to perpetuate about what's going on in that time. I know that we have seen some states pushing in the opposite direction of this, but I would like to see an election day in-hand deadline for mail-in ballots. It dramatically speeds up the reporting of results. You do have to pick a deadline eventually to say when ballots need to be in, and there's a real benefit to the health of the system by having those ballots be in hand by Election Day. And I will note states like Florida. You might have your thoughts on the politics of Florida. I was just came from Florida, beautiful state, man. Disney's still a lot of fun, even if I guess nobody's going. But Florida's a state that requires those ballots to be in hand by Election Day, and Florida turns around results what feels like within minutes of polls closing. It's incredibly helpful in a state where I think a third of voters vote by mail, a third of voters traditionally vote early in person, and a third of voters will vote on Election Day. It's a state that really conducts elections across all of the popular fronts, and they are able to turn around elections very quickly. So I wanted to make sure I highlighted that. The other thing that's been on my mind is this bigger picture discussions around the incentives created by the rules of our elections. I mentioned earlier this is something that R Street works on, but that we won't have time to discuss today. Fortunately, we will have time to discuss this today in the next segment of our elections policy discussion. I think it's starting at noon. Forgive me for not knowing the room, but there will be a discussion around primary elections. I want to take my moment to encourage everyone here to attend.
Great, thanks. And I want to thank the panel for a really great session. Don't need it? Okay, because I was going to say, I've learned not to be the person between the audience and lunch, and I was going to turn it over to Wendy so she would be, but she doesn't want it. So again, thank you all, thanks to the panel, and come to the next one.